Hello everyone, welcome to the second video in our exploration of the development of the Western hero. This is part 2, looking at Theseus and the new masculine standard. Remember in the previous video we talked about Heracles as serving as a bridge between the monster slayer and the humanist hero. So I want to look this time at Theseus. Theseus, as we said before, is a cousin of Heracles, a younger cousin. He wants very much to be like his cousin. He's interested in being heroic. And so I want to talk a little bit about his background, as I did with Heracles. There was a prophecy about his birth, as often happens in the ancient stories of the heroic, that he would one day supplant his father. His father sent him off to be raised by a humble couple, a humble farmer. But instead of trying to kill him, as so often happened in those myths, he left some artifacts for him, and different versions of the story list different ones, of sandals or a shield or a sword or what have you. But he left those under a boulder, and he told Theseus' foster father, he said, when he's old enough, tell him if he can move that stone to bring these artifacts with him to Athens, and I'll recognize him as my formal heir. And so Theseus, in contrast to Heracles, was born demigod, but he doesn't have the heroic qualities. He can't strangle snakes like his cousin could. And so he's raised humbly as a human for most of his life. When he reaches his majority, his foster father tells him about the boulder, and he goes and moves the boulder and finds the artifacts and prepares to go to Athens to claim his birthright. Now, he's got two different routes that he can go. He can go by sea and pretty much be there in a day, or he can go overland and take about a week and go experience some trials, some challenges. And so he chooses the overland route for two reasons. One, he's looking to be a king, so he has to develop a history of solving problems both intellectually and physically to show that he can protect his kingdom. And two, he wants to be like his cousin. And so he wants these physical challenges, these labors. So where Theseus slew monsters, he was unlike Heracles in that he became a king of Athens and a leader of men, and he came to be held, particularly by Pericles, as an example of the proper style and behavior of ultimate Greek masculinity in the 5th and 4th centuries. The other interesting distinction between him and Heracles in terms of leadership is that Heracles never sought a kingship. He never sought a crown. In fact, in the story of Jason and the Argonauts, when they're going off to collect the golden fleece, Jason gathers together many big-name heroes to travel with him, and Heracles is one of them. And someone at one point says, well, shouldn't we elect a leader? And everybody kind of turns and looks at Heracles, and Heracles says, nope, not me, not interested. It's Jason's quest. Let's let Jason run things. So Heracles was never really looking to be a leader of men the way that Theseus was. So Theseus takes this overland route, and he experiences 6 labors. And this is an interesting development in the tale. Where Heracles had 12, Theseus only has 6. He can do in half the labors what his cousin is able to do. And this, again, highlights this idea that as a primarily humanist hero, he is more capable. He can accomplish more in shorter time. So I want to look at these 6 labors that Theseus undergoes on his way to Athens. The first is when he met up with Periphetes, the club bearer, who beat his opponents into the earth, kind of like whack-a-mole. Theseus defeats him, takes from him the stout staff that identifies Theseus in many vase paintings. So this is a straight up monster slaying. He just defeats this character and then goes onward. And so there's no real thinking involved. So he starts off with a straight up monster slaying, just to show that he is like his cousin. He can do this. Then he comes to the Isthmian entrance to the underworld, where he meets a robber named Sinis. This guy would capture travelers and tie them between 2 pine trees that were bent down to the ground, and then let the trees go, tearing his victims apart. Theseus killed him by his own method, and then he had a child called Melanippus with Sinis' daughter Perugine, and established a new humanist dynasty. So there's a monster slaying element to this in that he's destroying Sinis, but at the same time he's replacing Sinis' rule of might makes right with a humanist rule. So there's, again, this transition into the more humanist mode. In another deed just north of the isthmus, he came to a place called Chromion, where he killed an enormous pig, the Chromion sow, which is bred by an old crone named Phaia. And this is an interesting distinction with Heracles again. Heracles captures and releases the Erymanthian boar, but Theseus kills the Chromion sow. And I think there's a very interesting distinction to be drawn here in that the boar that Heracles dealt with was male, and he showed it the respect due to a male. Theseus kills the sow, which is female, showing his masculine dominance over her. Near Megara, an elderly robber named Sciron forced travelers along the narrow cliff pathway to wash his feet, and while they knelt, he kicked them off the cliff behind them, where they were eaten by a sea monster, or in some versions a giant turtle, and Theseus pushed him off the cliff instead. So again, straight up monster slaying. No cogitation, no planning necessary here. Another, the enemies was Circean, the king of the holy side of Eleusis, who challenged passers-by to a wrestling match, and when he'd beaten them, he killed them. Theseus beat Circean at wrestling and then killed him instead, and overturned the archaic religious rite by refusing to be sacrificed, again establishing a new humanist tradition. And the last is my favorite, and this is the bandit called Procrustes the Stretcher, who had 2 beds, and he would offer one of those to travelers across the plain of Eleusis, and then made them fit into it, either by stretching them or cutting off their feet. So if they were a particularly tall person, he would offer them the smaller bed and then cut off their feet to make them fit. Or if they were a particularly small person, he would offer them the large bed and then stretch them to make them fit. Theseus turns the tables on him, cutting off his legs and decapitating him with his own axe. And why this is a particular favorite of mine, this last challenge of Theseus, is because it also reflects in the story this awareness that the Greeks in this time in history were becoming aware of the danger of uniformity, of conformity, of trying to make everyone fit the same mold and behave in the same way. Procrustes is this example of trying to remake people to fit them all into the same mold. And so what we see here is an early version of the thinking that's going to lead to the democratic ideology of the Greeks in later times. And so Theseus arrives in Athens, and first thing that happens is his stepmother tries to murder him because she wants her own son to become king, but he survives that. And then he hears about this tribute that Athens is having to pay to the island of Crete, to King Minos. And the way this came about is that King Minos was a particular devotee of Poseidon, and he was very proud of the relationship that he had with King Poseidon. And so one evening at a dinner party, he decides to show off a little. He wades into the ocean, and he prays to Poseidon. He throws his arms in the air. He says, "Oh, Lord Poseidon, please send me a beautiful, pure white bull that I can sacrifice in your honor." And the sea foams and boils and froths, and out walks this beautiful white bull, and everybody claps and applauds and goes back into the palace to continue drinking. And King Minos is kind of walking around this bull and looking at it, and he said, "Wow, this is a really beautiful animal. Be kind of ashamed to sacrifice this animal." So he sacrifices another one in its place, as if King Poseidon wouldn't know the difference. Now, in true Greek fashion, Poseidon doesn't punish the king directly. He is a representative of the gods on earth, and so he can't be seen to be weak. So instead of punishing Minos directly, he punishes Minos' wife, a woman named Pasiphae, by making her fall in love with the bull. She can't help herself. She is overcome, and this is carrying on that Greek tradition of once the gods get involved with you, you have no choice. You have to just go along. She resists as long as she can, but her passion for this bull is just insurmountable. And so finally she goes to Minos' chief architect, a man named Daedalus, whom you may have heard of in relation to his son Icarus and his unfortunate end. And she tells her story to Daedalus, and he's, well, it's kind of an odd request, but you are the queen, I'll see what I can do. So he builds a hollow replica of a cow, and they load the queen up into this replica cow and roll it out into the field. And the bull comes over and services the cow and Pasiphae at the same time, and her desire is sated. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, the Greeks believed that it was possible for a woman to become pregnant by more than one man at the same time. Well, they also believed it was possible for a woman to become pregnant by an animal. And that's exactly what happens. When the baby is born, it is born with a man's body and a bull's head. Now, some versions say it's the other way around, but more often you'll see the man's body with a bull's head. And an insatiable lust for human flesh. And when Minos sees this, he knows exactly what has happened. The jig is up. Poseidon knows that he sacrificed a different animal. He can't kill this thing. He's already in trouble with Minos. That would just make it worse. So he's not sure how to react here. He goes to Daedalus again and says, I need some help. What can you think of that we can do here? And Daedalus says, I have a brilliant plan. Let's build a big maze, and we'll put this thing in the middle of the maze, and you can send in political prisoners and prisoners of war and criminals and things like that. And if it finds them and eats them, it will survive. You're getting the undesirables out of your society. If it doesn't, it will starve to death, and then your problems are over, and you can't be held accountable for killing it because you left it up to fate. So Minos says, yeah, it's a great idea. Let's do that. And that's what they did. And it worked for a while, but then Minos begins running out of prisoners and criminals. And so he begins to make war on his neighbors to get prisoners of war, and at one point he goes to war with Athens, and Athens loses. Now, there are basically two things that happened to you in the ancient world when you lost a war. Either you were sold into slavery, or you had to pay tribute, which is basically protection money. It was an amount of money, a tax, they called it, or tribute, that you would send every year, basically to prevent your conqueror from beating you up anymore. Just like the bully in the schoolyard, give me your lunch money or I'm going to push your face in. And so that's how this arrangement had come to pass that Theseus becomes aware of when he arrives in Athens. And his reaction is not no, but hell no. We are Athenians, we are men, we are not animals, we are not victims, this is not going to stand. And so he says, next boat that's going, I'm on it. And the deal was for 6 virginal males and 6 virginal females, 7 in some versions of the story. So he gathers a few young men around him that he can trust, and the girls who've already been chosen, and they get on the boat, and it always sails under a black sail because it was a funerary boat. And he says to his father Aegeus, if I'm successful, I'll sail back under a white sail so that you'll know I've been successful. And they head off. Well, they arrive in Knossos, there, the palace of Knossos on Crete, and Minos is there at the wharf to greet them as he always is. And he notices he's got a somewhat better quality of male sacrifice than he's used to. And he sees this one young man who kind of seems to be the leader. And so he singles Theseus out. He's going to test him. And he walks up to him and he starts talking with him, and he shows him this ring that he's wearing. He says, you see this ring? This ring was given to me by Poseidon himself. That's the relationship that I have with the king of the sea. Would you like to try it on? And he takes it off and purposely fumbles and drops it, and it bounces along the wharf and falls into the water and sinks to the bottom of the bay. And everybody, oh my goodness, the ring is lost. And Theseus says, oh, no worry, I'll get it for you. And he jumps in after it. Now remember, Theseus is actually the son of Poseidon. He's not going to drown. He's down there for a long time, and people begin to believe that he has drowned. In the meantime, Ariadne, the king's daughter, has come down to the wharf to see what's taking so long. They're holding dinner for the king, and just as she walks up, Theseus comes bursting out of the water up onto the wharf with the water rippling down off of his golden skin and his bulging muscles, and Ariadne falls head over heels in love instantly. The reason being that the Greeks believed, as we've talked about before, that women could not control their sexuality, that they had a stronger sex drive than men and they couldn't control it. So, confronted with this demigod before her, she can't control herself. She immediately falls in love. She can't stand the thought that he might be eaten by the Minotaur. So, she, after they have been sent off to prepare them for the sacrifice, goes to guess who? Daedalus, and says, I can't stand the thought of him dying. Can you help me? He says, well, it's been too many years since I built the labyrinth. I don't know, can't remember if there even is a way out. But here, tell him to tie this piece of string by the doorway and play it out behind him. If he succeeds in meeting with the Minotaur and slaying it, he can follow the string back out. If he gets eaten, that's just the fate. So this is my favorite part of the myth, because I just imagine these guards completely ignoring him waddling up with this huge ball of twine. But he does as instructed, and he goes in and he defeats the Minotaur and comes back out, and King Minos is actually quite pleased about this. He doesn't need to press for the sacrifices anymore. His shame of the Minotaur has been dealt with. And so he says to Theseus, here as a reward, take my daughter Ariadne. Well, Ariadne's not particularly upset about this because she's already besotted. And they make ready and they set sail back off toward Athens. They stop to replenish their supplies at one point. And there's 2 versions of what happens next. In one of them, Athena appears to Theseus in a dream and instructs him to abandon Ariadne there. In another one, he just leaves her while she's sleeping and sails off without her. Now, don't panic on poor Ariadne's part. She eventually, Dionysus comes by and connects up with her, and she actually has a pretty good life after that. But the crux of this part of the story is very interesting because it shows this idea of masculinity in the Greek world at that time, that women were tools to be used to accomplish something and then discarded when they were no longer useful. And we see Ariadne serving this purpose in this story. Theseus gets on back to Athens. He either forgets or chooses not to fly the white sail, and so his father Aegeus sees the ship coming under black sail, believes that his son has been killed, throws himself off a cliff, and drowns in the sea that to this day bears his name, the Aegean Sea. Theseus comes back. After a respectable period of mourning, he becomes king, and things go well for a while. But later on, he and his friend are sitting around drinking wine, and they decide they'd like some new wives. And his friend picks none other than Persephone, the wife of Hades. And Theseus says, "Are you nuts? This is completely impossible. There's no way we're going to pull this off." But his friend insists, and so being a good friend, he says, "All right, we'll do what we can." So they go down to the realm there, and they're sitting with Hades and Persephone there, having a nice conversation. And they're smart enough. They've learned from Persephone's story not to eat or drink anything. But they say, "Well, it's about time for us to be going. We've enjoyed the visit." And they start to get up and realize that the stone chairs they've been sitting in have grown up and glued them down. And Hades looks at them and he said, "You didn't really think I didn't know what you were actually here for." And they begin to panic. And about that time, Heracles comes by with Cerberus on a leash here. He's come down on his 12th labor to collect Cerberus, and he sees what's going on there. And so he manages to help Theseus escape, but Theseus's friend is left there to stay in Hades for the rest of time. And so this is also a very interesting part of this story, in that Theseus is the humanist hero. He is a king, he is a good leader, and yet he needs in the ultimate challenge to be saved by the monster slayer. And I think this reflects this idea that the Greeks had, that even civilized men need to turn to barbarism at times to accomplish their goals or to protect themselves from attack. And so this is the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, and we'll pick up in the next video the explanations for why this new version of the masculine heroic became necessary in Greek culture.